You're watching the Everything Network.
Lester Joseph Gillis, also known as George Nelson and Babyface Nelson, was a bank robber within the States who became a criminal partner of John Dillinger when he helped Dillinger escape from prison in Crown Point, Indiana. Later, the FBI announced that Nelson and the remaining gang of bank robbers were collectively public enemy number one. The Babyface Nelson nickname derived from Gillis being a short man with a youthful appearance. However, in the professional realm, Gillis's fellow criminals addressed him as Jimmy. A violent bank robber, Lester Joseph Gillis has killed more agents of the FBI than any other criminal. FBI agents fatally wounded Babyface Nelson in the Battle of Barrington in November of 1934 that was fought in a suburb of Chicago. By the time he met his future wife, Helen Warziniak, Nelson was working at a Standard Oil station in his neighborhood, which doubled as the headquarters for a group of young tire thieves, known colloquially as strippers. Nelson fell into association with the strippers and acquainted himself with a number of local criminals, including one who employed him to drive bootleg alcohol throughout the Chicago suburbs. Nelson became associated with members of the suburb-based Toohey gang. Within 2 years, Nelson and the gang were involved in organized crime, especially armed robbery. On January 6, 1930, the associates forced entry into the home of magazine executive Charles M. Richter. After trussing him up with adhesive tape and cutting the phone lines, they ransacked the house and made off with approximately $205,000 worth of jewelry, around $3.9 million in today's dollars. 2 months later, they carried out a similar robbery at the bungalow of Lottie Brenner von Bülow on Sheridan Road. This job netted approximately $50,000 worth of jewelry. After the crime, Chicago newspapers nicknamed the group the Tape Bandits. On April 21, 1930, Nelson robbed a bank for the first time, making off with approximately $4,000. A month later, he and his gang netted $25,000 worth of jewelry from home invasions. 5 months later, Nelson robbed the Itasca State Bank of just over $4,000. A teller later identified him as one of the robbers. 3 nights later, he stole the jewelry of the wife of Chicago Mayor Big Bill Thompson, valued at $18,000. She described her attacker saying he had a baby face. He was good-looking, hardly more than a boy, had dark hair and was wearing a gray topcoat and a brown felt hat, turned down brim. Nelson and his crew were later linked to a botched roadhouse robbery in Summit, Illinois, on November 23, 1930. In the ensuing gunfight, 3 people were killed and 3 wounded. 3 nights later, his gang robbed a tavern on Waukegan Road. This is when Babyface Nelson committed his first murder of note, when he fatally shot stockbroker Edwin Thompson. Throughout the winter of 1931, most of the Tape Bandits were rounded up, including Nelson. The Chicago Tribune referred to their leader as George Babyface Nelson, who received a sentence of 1 year to life in the state penitentiary at Joliet. Nelson escaped during a prison transfer in February 1932. Aided by his contacts within the Toohey gang, he fled west to Reno, where he was harbored by William Graham, a known crime boss and gambler. Using the alias Jimmy Johnson, Babyface went to Sausalito, California, where he worked for bootlegger Joe Parente. During his San Francisco Bay Area criminal ventures, he met John Paul Chase and Fatso Negri, who later became close associates. In Reno the next winter, Nelson first met the vacationing Alvin Karpis, who in turn introduced him to Midwestern bank robber Eddie Bentz. Teaming up with Bentz, Nelson returned to the Midwest the next summer. He committed a major bank robbery in Grand Haven, Michigan, on August 18, 1933, his first in the area. The robbery was not lucrative, though most of those involved made a full escape. The Grand Haven bank robbery convinced Nelson he was ready to lead his own gang. Through connections at the Green Lantern Tavern in St. Paul, Nelson recruited Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green. With these men and two other local thieves, he robbed the First National Bank of Brainerd, Minnesota, of $32,000 on October 3, 1933, equivalent to approximately $777,000 in 2024 dollars. Witnesses reported that Nelson wildly sprayed submachine gun bullets at bystanders as he made his getaway. After collecting his wife Helen and 4-year-old son Ronald, Nelson left with his crew for San Antonio, Texas. While there, him and his gang bought several weapons from underworld gunsmith Hyman Lehman. One of those weapons was a .38 Super Colt pistol that had been modified so it was fully automatic. He used this gun to kill Special Agent Carter Baum at Little Bohemia Lodge several months later. On December 9, 1933, a local woman tipped off San Antonio police regarding the presence nearby of high-powered northern gangsters. 2 days later, Tommy Carroll was cornered by 2 detectives and opened fire, killing Detective Perrin and wounding Detective Al Hartman. All of Nelson's gang, except for him, fled San Antonio. Him and his wife traveled west to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he recruited John Paul Chase and Fatso Negri for a new wave of bank robberies the following spring. On March 3, 1934, Dillinger made his famous wooden pistol escape from the jail in Crown Point, Indiana. Although the details remain in some dispute, the escape is suspected to have been arranged and financed by members of Nelson's newly formed gang, including Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, Eddie Green, and John Red Hamilton, with the understanding that Dillinger would repay some part of the bribe money out of his share of the first robbery. The night Dillinger arrived in the Twin Cities, Nelson and his friend John Paul Chase were cut off by another car driven by local paint salesman Theodore Kidder. Nelson lost his temper and gave chase, crowding Kidder to the curb. The salesman exited his vehicle to protest, whereupon Nelson shot him dead. 2 days after this, the new gang, with Hamilton's participation as the sixth man uncertain, struck the Security National Bank at Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In the robbery, which netted around $49,000, figures differ slightly, Nelson severely wounded motorcycle policeman Hale Keith with a burst of submachine gun fire as the officer was arriving at the scene. The 6 men were soon identified as the Second Dillinger Gang, due to Dillinger's extreme notoriety, but the gang had no official leader. On March 13th, a week after the robbery in Sioux Falls, the gang robbed the First National Bank in Mason City, Iowa. Dillinger and Hamilton were both shot and wounded in the robbery, where they made off with $52,000. On April 3rd, federal agents ambushed and killed Eddie Green, though he was unarmed and they were uncertain of his identity. Harold Eugene Eddie Green was an American bank robber and Depression-era outlaw during the 1930s, best known as a member of the John Dillinger Gang. He was also associated with Frank Jelly Nash, Volney Davis, and the Barker Karpus Gang in his early career. Green was considered a highly intelligent criminal and expert jug marker, widely known to employ tactics such as casing banks and planning escape routes that he drove prior to a robbery to ensure a perfect getaway. His connections with corrupt politicians and police officials in St. Paul, Minnesota, made him extremely useful in setting up safe houses and provide warning from police raids. In the aftermath of the Mason City robbery, Nelson and John Paul Chase fled west to Reno, where their old bosses Bill Graham and Jim McKay were fighting a federal mail fraud case. Years later, the FBI determined that on March 22, 1934, Nelson and Chase abducted and killed the chief witness against the pair, Roy Fritsch. Fritsch's quartered body was said to have been thrown down an abandoned mine shaft and was never found. On the afternoon of April 20th, Nelson, Dillinger, Van Meter, Carroll, Hamilton, plus gang associate and errand runner Pat Riley, were accompanied by Nelson's wife Helen and 3 girlfriends of the other men, arrived at the secluded Little Bohemia Lodge in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin, for a weekend of rest. The gang's connection to the resort apparently came from previous dealings between Dillinger's attorney, Louis Piquet, and lodge owner Emil Wanatka. Though gang members greeted him by name, Wanatka maintained that he was unaware of their identities until sometime later that night. According to Brian Burroughs' book Public Enemies, America's Greatest Crime Wave and the Birth of the FBI, this most likely happened when Wanatka was playing cards with Dillinger, Nelson, and Hamilton. When Dillinger won a round and raked in the pot, Wanatka caught a glimpse of Dillinger's pistol concealed in his coat and noticed that Nelson and the others also had shoulder holsters. The following day, while she was away from the lodge with her young son at a children's birthday party, Wanatka's wife informed a friend, Henry Voss, that the Dillinger gang was at the lodge, and the FBI was subsequently given the tip early on April 22nd. Melvin Purvis and a number of agents arrived by plane from Chicago, and with the gang's departure imminent, attacked the lodge quickly and with little preparation, and without notifying or obtaining help from local authorities. Wanatka offered a $1 dinner special on Sunday nights, and the last of a crowd estimated at around 70 people were leaving as the agents arrived in the front driveway. A 1933 Chevrolet was leaving at that moment with 3 departing lodge customers, John Hoffman, Eugene Boisneau, and John Morris, who apparently did not hear an order to halt because the car radio drowned out the agents yelling at them to stop. The agents quickly opened fire on them, instantly killing Boisneau and wounding the others, and alerting the gang members inside. Adding to the chaos, at this moment Pat Riley returned to the lodge after an out-of-town errand for Van Meter, accompanied by John Hamilton's girlfriend, Pat Charrington. Accosted by the agents, Riley and Charrington backed out and escaped under fire. Dillinger, Van Meter, Hamilton, and Carroll escaped through the back of the lodge, which was unguarded, and made their way north on foot through woods and past a lake to commandeer a car and a driver at a resort a mile away. Carroll was not far behind them. He made it to Manitowish and stole a car, making it uneventfully to St. Paul. Nelson, who had been outside the lodge in the adjacent cabin, characteristically attacked the raiding party head-on, exchanging fire with Purvis, before retreating into the lodge under a return volley from other agents. From there he slipped out the back and fled in the opposite direction from the others. Emerging from the woods 90 minutes later, a mile away from Little Bohemia, Nelson kidnapped the Lange couple from their home and ordered them to drive him away. Apparently dissatisfied with the car's speed, he quickly ordered them to pull up at a brightly lit house where the switchboard operator, Alvin Corner, aware of the ongoing events, quickly phoned authorities at one of the involved lodges to report a suspicious vehicle in front of his home. Shortly after Nelson had entered the home, taking the Corners hostage, Emil Wanatka arrived with his brother-in-law George Laporte and a lodge employee, while a 4th man remained in the car and were also taken prisoner. Nelson ordered Corner and Wanatka back into their vehicle, where the 4th man remained unnoticed in the back seat. As they were preparing to leave, with Wanatka driving at gunpoint, another car arrived with 2 federal agents, W. Carter Baum and J. Newman, as well as a local constable, Carl Christensen. Nelson asked the agents who they were, and upon the agents identifying themselves, Nelson quickly opened fire with his fully automatic pistol, severely wounding Christensen and Newman and killing Baum, who was hit 3 times in the neck. Nelson was later quoted as having said that Baum had him cold and could not understand why he had not fired. It was found that the safety catch on Baum's gun was on. Nelson stole the FBI car. Less than 15 miles away, the car suffered a flat tire and finally became mired in mud as Nelson attempted unsuccessfully to change it. Back on foot, he wandered into the woods and took up residence with a Chippewa family in their secluded cabin for several days before making his final escape in another commandeered vehicle. 3 of the women who had accompanied the gang, including Nelson's wife Helen, were captured inside the lodge. After grueling interrogations by the FBI, the 3 were ultimately convicted on harboring charges and released on parole. With an agent and an innocent bystander dead and 4 more severely wounded, including 2 more innocent bystanders, as well as the complete escape of the Dillinger gang, the FBI came under severe criticism, with calls for Director J. Edgar Hoover's resignation and a widely circulated petition demanding Purvis's suspension. At the time of the Little Bohemia shootout, Nelson's identity as a member of the Dillinger gang had been known to the FBI for 2 weeks. Following the killing of Baum, Nelson became nationally notorious and was made a high-priority target of the Bureau. The focus on him and the murdered agent served to deflect some of the intense criticism directed at Hoover and Purvis following the Little Bohemia debacle. A day after the Little Bohemia raid, Dillinger, Hamilton, and Van Meter ran through a police roadblock near Hastings, Minnesota, drawing fire from officers there. A ricocheting bullet struck Hamilton in the back, fatally wounding him. Hamilton reportedly died in hiding on April 30th or May 1st, 1934, and was secretly buried by Dillinger and others, including Nelson, who had rejoined the gang in Aurora, Illinois. Little is known of John Hamilton's life prior to his criminal career. He was born on August 27, 1898, in Byng Inlet, Ontario, Canada, to an Irish-Canadian father from Essex County, Ontario, and a German-American woman from New York. Hamilton was nicknamed Three-Fingered Jack, having lost 2 of his right fingers in a sledding accident when he was young. He was convicted of the robbery at a gas station in St. Joseph County, Indiana, and sentenced to 25 years in prison in 1927. While incarcerated in Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Hamilton befriended a number of prominent bank robbers, such as John Dillinger, Russell Clark, Charles Mackley, Harry Pierpont, and Homer Van Meter. Dillinger was paroled in May of 1933, but swore to liberate his friends and had handguns smuggled into Hamilton, Mackley, Pierpont, Clark, and several other convicts. On September 26, 1933, a total of 10 armed men, including Hamilton, escaped from the main gate of Indiana State Prison. Soon afterwards, the gang learned that Dillinger had in the meantime been arrested for bank robbery and was being detained at the Allen County Jail in Lima, Ohio. Determined to free Dillinger, the gang needed cash to fund an escape, so on October 3, 1933, they robbed the First National Bank of St. Mary's, Ohio, escaping with $14,000. On December 13, 1933, the Dillinger gang executed an armed invasion of a Chicago bank to empty its safe deposit boxes, netting the gang as much as $50,000. A day later, after Hamilton had left his car at a Chicago garage for some body work, the garage's mechanic called police with his suspicion that it was a gangster car. When Hamilton returned to pick up the car and found a police detective, William Shanley, and 2 other officers waiting to question him, he opened fire, killing Shanley and managing to elude capture by the other 2 officers. This incident led to the Chicago Police Department forming a 40-man Dillinger squad. On January 15, 1934, Hamilton and Dillinger robbed the First National Bank in East Chicago, Indiana, for $20,376. During the heist, police officer William O'Malley was shot dead. Dillinger was officially charged with the murder, but several witnesses indicated that Hamilton was the shooter. By the end of the year, Hamilton found himself ranked 3rd on Indiana's list of public enemies, after Dillinger and Harry Pierpont. Hamilton himself, shot twice during the East Chicago robbery, was left in the care of his girlfriend, Pat Charrington, and underworld physician Joseph Moran, while Dillinger and the others headed to Tucson, where they were apprehended by the authorities. After this incident, for a short time, Hamilton was at the top of the public enemies list until Dillinger managed to escape from Crown Point and mustered a new gang that consisted of Hamilton, Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, Eddie Green, and Babyface Nelson. Now the subjects of a massive manhunt and media campaign, Hamilton and Dillinger made a discreet visit to his sister's home in Michigan on April 17th. After returning to Chicago, the gang retreated to the Little Bohemia Resort near Rhinelander, Wisconsin. On April 22nd, the place was raided by the FBI under the direction of Melvin Purvis, who had received a tip about the gang's whereabouts from Henry Voss, a friend of Emil Wanatka, Little Bohemia's owner. Unfortunately, the raid did not go as planned. The agents mistakenly opened fire on a car that contained 3 local work camp employees, Eugene Boisneau, John Hoffman, and John Morris, after thinking they were gangsters. Boisneau was killed, and Hoffman and Morris were both wounded. Dillinger, Hamilton, Van Meter, and Tommy Carroll escaped by jumping from a second-floor window in the back of the lodge onto a mound of frozen snow, then running along the shore of Star Lake. Dillinger, Hamilton, and Van Meter eventually stole a car from a carpenter a half-mile northwest of Little Bohemia. A day later, on April 23rd, Hamilton, Dillinger, and Homer Van Meter were again confronted by authorities in Hastings, Minnesota, and another shootout ensued. Hamilton was mortally wounded by a bullet as he and the rest of the gang escaped in a car. The gang again took him to see Dr. Joseph Moran in Chicago. For some reason, Moran refused to treat Hamilton. Dillinger then hid the dying Hamilton with Volney Davis and Edna Murray in Aurora, Illinois. Hamilton reportedly died on April 26, 1934. Dillinger and Davis buried their friend near Oswego, Illinois, and Dillinger reportedly covered Hamilton's face and hands with lye to hinder any later attempt to identify the body. Not yet knowing that Hamilton had died almost 3 weeks prior, authorities indicted him on May 19th of harboring fugitives. Hamilton's sister was convicted of the same charge and spent a short time in prison. There were at the time several persistent rumors that Hamilton was actually still alive. The FBI received numerous tips from people claiming to have seen or heard from Hamilton. Even Hamilton's nephew maintained that he had personally visited his uncle in Ontario after his supposed death. Nevertheless, no hard evidence for Hamilton's survival has ever been discovered. The amalgam restorations on the teeth of the body, identified by Davis and Murray as Hamilton's, were compared with his dental records from Indiana State Penitentiary and were matched. On June 7th, gang member Tommy Carroll was killed while trying to evade arrest in Waterloo, Iowa. Carroll and his girlfriend, Jean Crompton, who had been captured and tried with Helen Gillis after Little Bohemia, had grown close to the Nelsons, and his death was a personal blow to them. Nelson and his wife went into hiding during the ensuing weeks, and although they were in the Chicago area, their precise movements in this period remain obscure. The Nelsons reportedly lived in various tourist camps while continuing to secretly meet with family members whenever possible. Thomas Leonard Carroll was a bank robber and Depression-era outlaw. A boxer turned criminal, he committed numerous robberies during the 1920s and 1930s and was a longtime member of the Dillinger Gang. An ex-boxer who once had his jaw broken in the ring, giving him a lantern jaw appearance, Carroll served in World War I. He was first arrested on January 24, 1920, and served 60 days in the Douglas County, Nebraska jail for investigation. On October 24, 1921, Carroll was arrested for larceny in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and remained in jail for nearly 4 months before his conviction on February 7, 1922. Sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, he spent a year in the Anamosa State Reformatory before his parole in March 1923. He continued to have run-ins with the law during the next few years, managing to avoid more jail time. He was twice charged with robbery, first in Kansas City on November 21, 1924, and again in St. Louis on August 11, 1925, and both cases were dropped. The following year, on August 28, 1926, he was jailed in St. Louis for auto theft, but released without trial. He was picked up by police in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for carrying a concealed weapon on September 15th, but the charges were dropped. Returned to St. Joseph, he was arrested for bank robbery on September 29, 1926, and held until his trial and acquittal on January 11, 1927. Tommy's luck ran out in April of 1927 when he was convicted of armed robbery in Missouri and sentenced to 5 years in prison in Jefferson City. He was later released on parole, but only a brief time, as he was quickly rearrested, tried and convicted under the newly passed Dyer Act, and spent 21 months in Leavenworth Prison until his parole in October 1931. He disappeared for a year and a half before he was arrested in St. Paul, Minnesota, on May 17, 1933, for possession of burglar's tools. He was able to negotiate his release, and the charges against him were dropped. It was after this experience that Carroll became determined to break into major crime with a skilled team. Carroll joined the John Dillinger gang sometime in late 1933 and participated in his first robbery with the gang on October 23, 1933, when he joined Babyface Nelson, Homer Van Meter, John Paul Chase, and Charles Fisher in the robbery of $32,000 from a bank in Brainerd, Minnesota. On November 11th, he was spotted and pursued by 2 Minneapolis detectives, managing to escape. Carroll soon after traveled to San Antonio, Texas, to purchase weapons from gunsmith Hyman Lehman on behalf of Nelson and the others. Carroll was forced to return when a chance encounter with police turned into a shootout, leaving Detective H.C. Perro dead. In February 1934, Tommy was sent by Homer Van Meter to Crown Point, Indiana, to deliver a cash payment to help break John Dillinger from the local jail. Tommy was not yet an associate of Dillinger's and was easily able to pass through the town without notice. So on March 3rd, Dillinger escaped from Crown Point and went to St. Paul, where he met Tommy. 3 days later, he joined Carroll, Van Meter, Nelson, John Red Hamilton, and Eddie Green in stealing $49,500 from a bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Tommy was assigned to watch the street and captured 12 police officers single-handed. Babyface, however, shot and wounded motorcycle officer Hale Keith before they made their getaway back to St. Paul. He was the wheelman a week later when the gang made their biggest score yet. On March 13th, they robbed First National Bank in Mason City, Iowa, of $52,344. The robbery had attracted so much attention that they couldn't risk staying in the city long and decided to disappear for a while. The FBI followed the gang to their hideout and, on the night of April 22nd, Melvin Purvis led a raid against the lodge. The raid resulted in disaster, with federal agents killing 1 civilian, Eugene Boiseneau, 35, from the Mercer CCC camp. Federal agents also wounded John Hoffman, 28, a gas station attendant, and John Morris, 59, the Mercer camp cook. Babyface Nelson killed Agent Carter Baum and wounded Agent Jay Newman and local constable Carl Christensen at Alvin Corner's place, south of Little Bohemia. All the outlaws easily escaped. Carroll had fled through the woods and ended up in a nearby crossroads community. He then stole a car and drove down a logging road 12 miles north of the lodge. When the road turned out to be a dead end, he left the car and escaped on foot, while federal agents were arresting the women who had been found at the lodge with the gang. Carroll's wife, Jean Delaney Carroll, or Crompton, sister-in-law of Alvin Karpis, was among the women arrested and charged with harboring fugitives. She was later put on probation instead of serving a jail sentence. Tommy remained on the run with Dillinger and Van Meter for almost a month and eventually hid out in a cabin outside East Chicago, Indiana. On May 19th, he and the rest of the gang were indicted by a federal grand jury in Madison, Wisconsin, and charged with harboring each other as fugitives. Later that month, as the gang went their separate ways, he was reunited with his wife, who violated her probation to join him. Carroll and his girlfriend, Jean Delaney, sister of Alvin Karpus's girlfriend, Dolores Delaney, managed to evade the authorities for only a few weeks following their departure from Dillinger. On Wednesday, June 6, 1934, they checked into the Evening Star tourist camp, about 5 miles south of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The next morning they drove to Waterloo, Iowa, arriving at 10:30 or 11, according to Delaney's later statement, with plans to get her fitted for glasses. They ate breakfast. Then she bought a brown dress at 226 East 4th Street, which she put on and wore away from the store. The two then went to get her glasses. Delaney later told police that she had recently dyed her hair black. She said she had done so not with a view to hide her identity, but because she was tired of blonde hair, and that they had called her Mae West in jail at Madison. They stopped to fill up at a gas station, then headed to a beer parlor shortly after lunch. The station attendant had noticed a collection of out-of-state license plates in the back seat of Tommy's new bronze-colored Hudson sedan, motor number 32148, with Missouri license 53970, and called local police after they had left. The attendant gave police the make of the car and the license plate number. Detectives Emil Steffen and P.E. Walker began cruising about looking for the suspicious vehicle without success, and had returned to the station when suddenly the car was spotted across the street. Carroll had carelessly parked the car across from the Waterloo police garage. Steffen and Walker watched a man and a woman come out of the beer parlor and walk to the Hudson. The detectives approached. Delaney got in the car. Walker said to Carroll, "You're under arrest." "The hell I am," answered Carroll. Carroll reached for his gun, dropping it underneath the car after Walker had given him a short left to the jaw, knocking him off balance. Carroll then ran into a nearby alley. Steffen and Walker opened fire, shooting 5 times with 4 hitting Carroll. 3 lodged in his chest and 1 pierced the 4th lumbar vertebrae of the spine. En route to the hospital, Carroll admitted who he was to the detective. Steffen attempted to get further information, but Carroll stated he had no statement to make or word to send anyone, and that his parents were dead. Reporter Francis Veach, along with John Gwynn, the Black Hawk County attorney, and Assistant County Attorney Burr Town, were admitted into Carroll's room at the St. Francis Hospital. Dr. Paul O'Keefe, Wade Priest, and J.R. O'Keefe were also at the bedside. Veach asked Carroll, who was now breathing heavily, if he had anything to say. "I'm hit, buddy. That's all. I'm hit." Veach also asked Carroll if he wanted a priest. Thanking him, Carroll said the priest had already been in his room. Veach left the hospital and went to the county jail to interview Jean Delaney. He asked her if she had a message to take back to Carroll. "Tell him that I said not to die and that they are going to let me see him in the hospital. Tell him that I love him. He was always good and kind to me, and the things they say about him aren't true. We just stopped in Waterloo to get my glasses fitted." Veach told her he would deliver the message. When he arrived back at the hospital, he learned that Carroll had died just before he got there, about 6 p.m. He returned to the jail and told Jean that her message had been delivered, thinking it might soften the blow somewhat. 2 days after Tommy's death, Jean Delaney was sentenced to a year and a day for violating her parole and later miscarried their child. On June 27th, former gang errand runner and Little Bohemia fugitive Pat Riley was arrested in St. Paul, Minnesota. On the morning of June 30th, Nelson, Dillinger, Van Meter, and 1 or more additional accomplices robbed the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. One man involved in the robbery is believed to have been Pretty Boy Floyd, based on several eyewitness identifications as well as the later account of Joseph Fatso Negri, an old Nelson associate from California who was serving as a gopher for the gang at this time. Another rumored participant was Nelson's childhood friend, Jack Perkins, also an associate of the gang at that time. Perkins was later tried for the robbery and acquitted. When the robbery began, policeman Howard Wagner had been directing traffic outside. Responding quickly to the scene and attempting to draw his gun, he was shot dead by Van Meter, who was stationed outside the bank. During the shootout that followed, Nelson exchanged fire with a local jeweler, Harry Berg, who had shot him in the chest, ineffectively, because of Nelson's bulletproof vest. As Berg retreated into his store under a return volley from Nelson, a man in a parked car was wounded. Nelson also grappled briefly with a teenage boy, Joseph Pawlowski, who tackled him until Nelson, or Van Meter, stunned Pawlowski with a blow from his gun. When Dillinger and the man identified as Floyd, unconfirmed, emerged from the bank with sacks containing $28,000, they brought 3 hostages with them, including the bank president, to deter gunfire from 3 patrolmen on the scene. The policemen fired nonetheless, wounding 2 of the hostages before grazing Van Meter in the head. The gang escaped, and Van Meter recovered. In the constant and chaotic exchange of gunfire, several other bystanders were wounded by shots, ricochets, or flying broken glass. It was the last confirmed robbery for all of the known and suspected participants, including Floyd, but this was unconfirmed. During the month of July, as the FBI manhunt for him continued, Nelson and his wife fled to California with associate John Paul Chase, who remained with Nelson for the rest of his life. Upon their return to Chicago on July 15th, the gang held a reunion meeting at a favorite rendezvous site. When the meeting was interrupted by 2 Illinois state troopers, Fred McAllister and Gilbert Cross, Nelson fired on their vehicle with his converted machine gun pistol, wounding both men as the gangsters retreated. Cross was badly wounded, but both he and McAllister survived. Nelson's responsibility was uncertain until verification came later in the form of a confession from Chase. On August 23rd, Van Meter was ambushed and killed by police in St. Paul, Minnesota, leaving Nelson as the sole survivor of the so-called Second Dillinger Gang. In the ensuing months, Nelson and his wife, usually accompanied by Chase, drifted west to cities including Sacramento and San Francisco, and Reno and Las Vegas, Nevada. They often stayed in auto camps, including Wally's Hot Springs outside Genoa, Nevada, where they hid out from October 1st before returning to Chicago around November 1st. Nelson's movements during the final month of his life are largely unknown. By the end of the month, FBI interest had settled on a former hideout of Nelson's, the Lake Como Inn in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where it was believed that he might return for the winter. When the Nelsons and Chase did return to the inn on November 27th, they briefly came face to face with surprised and unprepared FBI agents who had staked it out. The fugitives sped away before any shots were fired. Armed with a description of the car and its license plate number, agents swarmed into the area. A short but furious gun battle between FBI agents and Nelson took place on November 27, 1934, outside Chicago in the town of Barrington, culminating in the deaths of Babyface Nelson and FBI agents Herman Ed Hollis and Samuel P. Cowley. On the morning of November 27th, Nelson, along with his wife Helen Gillis and associate John Paul Chase, headed south in a stolen V8 Ford towards Chicago on U.S. Highway 12, now U.S. 14. Babyface, always keen to spot federal agents, caught sight of a sedan driven in the opposite direction by agents Thomas McDade and William Ryan. Both parties simultaneously recognized each other, and after several U-turns by both vehicles, Nelson wound up in pursuit of the agent's car. When Nelson's powerful Ford caught up to the agent's slower sedan, Chase opened fire on the agents. Ryan and McDade returned fire, sped up, then pulled into a field and awaited Nelson and Chase, who had stopped pursuing. McDade and Ryan were unaware that one of their bullets had punctured one of the water pumps on Nelson's Ford. With Nelson's Ford rapidly losing power, a Hudson automobile driven by Hollis, who had been given credit as one of the agents who fired the fatal shots that killed Dillinger the previous July, and Cowley, began pursuing the Ford. With his pursuers attempting to pull alongside, Nelson skidded into the entrance to Barrington's North Side Park. Hollis and Cowley overshot Nelson's car by over 100 feet and stopped at an angle. Upon exiting the vehicle's passenger door, the agents took cover behind their car. The ensuing shootout was witnessed by more than a dozen people. Nelson yelled to Helen to take cover in a nearby ditch. Then he and Chase opened fire on the agents. Both Cowley and Hollis returned fire from behind their vehicle. A single slug from Cowley's machine gun struck Nelson in the lower abdomen. Nelson leaned on the Ford's running board, then wordlessly exchanged weapons with Chase. In the din of the gun battle, Chase heard Nelson complain that his weapon was jamming, and the wounded Nelson swapped it out for either a Winchester or a Colt Monitor automatic rifle. Despite his grievous wound, Nelson moved from behind the car and advanced toward the agents while firing his weapon. 2 of his bullets struck Cowley. Several buckshot pellets from Hollis's shotgun then struck Nelson in the legs and knocked him down. Hollis was pronounced dead soon after arriving at the hospital. At a different hospital, Cowley lived for long enough to confer briefly with Melvin Purvis and have surgery before succumbing to a stomach wound similar to Babyface Nelson's. Following a telephone tip from a Chicago telephone company employee, Carl Feary, who was working on the telephone lines and saw a body on the ground, Nelson's body was discovered wrapped in an Indian-patterned blanket by FBI agent Walter Walsh in a ditch on the northeast corner of the St. Paul's Lutheran Cemetery in Skokie and taken to Haben's funeral home, both of which still exist. Helen later stated that she had placed the blanket around Nelson's body because he always hated being cold. Eddie Bentz and Harvey Bailey were still the prime suspects in the infamous bank robbery of almost $3 million in Lincoln, Nebraska on September 17, 1930, although neither was ever charged for that robbery. During 1932, he began teaming with Albert Bates and George Machine Gun Kelly, robbing a bank in Ponder, Texas in July and another in Colfax, Washington on September 21st, taking $70,000 in cash and bonds. The robberies were wrongly attributed to Bonnie and Clyde and Pretty Boy Floyd, respectively. 8 days after the Colfax robbery, Bentz and several unidentified accomplices raided another bank in Holland, Michigan. Bentz went into semi-retirement after that job and was living in Long Beach, Indiana. Before Babyface Nelson died, he asked Bentz to join him and his gang in planning the robbery of a bank in Grand Haven, Michigan. Bentz agreed, and the getaway driver fled on the day of the robbery, stranding Bentz, Nelson, and the others. One of the robbers, Eddie Doyle, was arrested. However, the rest of the robbers managed to escape in a second waiting car with $30,000. John Dillinger was widely speculated to have been one of the participants. However, historical evidence indicates he was involved in bank heists on his own in Indiana and Ohio at the time of the robbery. In spite of the federal government placing most bank robberies under federal jurisdiction, which consequently would involve the FBI's hunting down many Depression-era outlaws, Bentz remained a fugitive. On July 4, 1934, he and several unidentified accomplices robbed a bank in Danville, Vermont, but escaped with only $8,500. It is unclear if that was the last robbery Bentz participated in, but he was not identified in any other holdups after the Danville robbery. Bentz was eventually tracked down to an address in Brooklyn, New York, and arrested by federal agents on March 13, 1936, finding him hiding in a dumbwaiter. Taken into custody, he refused to name his accomplices in the Danville robbery and was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. At the time of his sentencing, Bentz asked to be sent to Alcatraz, supposedly stating to the judge that all my friends are there. He was eventually paroled from Alcatraz in 1948 and returned to his hometown in Tacoma, where he died of a heart attack on October 31st, 1979. George Kelly Barnes, better known by his nickname Machine Gun Kelly, was an American gangster from Memphis, Tennessee, active during the Prohibition era. His nickname came from his favorite weapon, a Thompson submachine gun. He is best known for the kidnapping of oil tycoon and businessman Charles F. Urschel in July 1933, from which he and his gang collected a $200,000 ransom. Urschel had collected and left considerable evidence that assisted the subsequent FBI investigation, which eventually led to Kelly's arrest in Memphis on September 26, 1933. His crimes also included bootlegging and armed robbery. Kelly's first sign of trouble came when he enrolled at Mississippi State University to study agriculture in 1917. From the beginning, he was considered a poor student with his highest grade, a C+, awarded for good physical hygiene. He was constantly in trouble with the faculty and spent much of his academic career attempting to work off the demerits he had earned. It was during this time that he met a young woman by the name of Geneva Ramsey. Kelly quickly fell in love with Geneva and made an abrupt decision to quit school and marry. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s and 1930s, he worked as a bootlegger for himself as well as a colleague. After a short time and several run-ins with the local Memphis police, he decided to leave town and head west with his girlfriend. To protect his family and to escape law enforcement officers, he changed his name to George Kelly. He continued to commit smaller crimes and bootlegging. He was arrested in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1928 for smuggling liquor onto a Native American reservation and sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth Penitentiary, Kansas, beginning February 11, 1928. He was reportedly a model inmate and was released early. Shortly thereafter, Kelly married Catherine Thorne, an experienced criminal who purchased Kelly's first machine gun and insisted, despite his lack of interest in weapons, that he perform target practice in the countryside. She also went to great lengths to familiarize his name within underground crime circles. According to Persons in Hiding, a 1938 book by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Machine Gun Kelly worked with Catherine and Eddie Dahl in the kidnapping of a wealthy manufacturer in South Bend, Indiana, for a $50,000 ransom. Similar claims were made in several 1937 American Magazine articles co-authored by Hoover. While Hoover chose not to name the victim in either his book or magazine articles, local newspaper stories about Hoover's claims assumed that he was referring to the January 26, 1932, abduction of Howard Arthur Wolverton. Wolverton was released unharmed after less than 24 hours in captivity, and the crime was essentially forgotten in the following decades, but his kidnapping was reported widely at the time and proved to be historic, characterized by contemporary reporting as a turning point in America's growing kidnapping scourge. The New York Daily News called his abduction spectacular, asserted that for brazen audacity it has no parallel, and suggested that such crimes represent a challenge to organized society. Wolverton's kidnapping revived consideration of the Lindbergh Law in Congress and spawned several nationally distributed newspaper projects that sought to take the full measure of the growing crime wave and which described kidnapping as a threat to every American. Completion of these projects, including a 16-part series in the Daily News, were ready for publication within days of the March 1, 1932, kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh, Jr., meaning that the infant's abduction was presented not as a single crime, but as part of a growing national problem. Machine Gun Kelly's last criminal activity was another history-making abduction, the July 1933 kidnapping of wealthy Oklahoma City resident Charles Urschel and his friend Walter R. Jarrett, which would prove to be his undoing. The Kellys demanded a ransom of $200,000 and held Urschel at the farm of Catherine's mother and stepfather. Urschel, having been blindfolded, made note of evidence of his experience, including remembering background sounds, counting footsteps, and leaving fingerprints on surfaces in reach. This proved invaluable for the FBI in its investigation, as agents concluded that Urschel had been held in Paradise, Texas, based on sounds that Urschel remembered hearing while he was being held hostage. An investigation conducted in Memphis disclosed that the Kellys were living at the residence of J.C. Tichenor. Special agents from Birmingham, Alabama, were immediately dispatched to Memphis, where, in the early morning hours of September 26, 1933, a raid was conducted. George and Catherine Kelly were taken into custody by FBI agents and Memphis police officer Thomas Watterson and Sergeant William Rainey. It is often reported that Kelly was caught without a weapon and allegedly shouted, "Don't shoot," as he surrendered to FBI agents. This version of events appears to be a media myth created months after the arrest. Another version of the raid alleged Kelly had a pistol in his hand, but with a shotgun aimed at his heart he surrendered, saying, "I've been expecting you." However, the FBI's earliest account of the event was written between 3 and 5 days after Kelly's arrest and states, Agent William Asbury Rohrer saw that Kelly had proceeded into the front bedroom and was in a corner with his hands raised. He was covered by Memphis Police Sergeant William Rainey, with Kelly not reported to have spoken at all. The arrest of the Kellys was overshadowed by the escape of 10 inmates, including all of the members of the future Dillinger Gang, from the penitentiary in Michigan City, Indiana, that same night. The trial was held at the post office, courthouse, and federal office building in Oklahoma City, with Judge Edgar S. Vaught presiding. On October 12, 1933, George and Catherine Kelly were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. An investigation in Coleman, Texas, disclosed that the Kellys had been housed and protected by Cassie Earl Coleman and Will Casey, and that Coleman had assisted George Kelly in storing $73,250 of the Urschel ransom money on his ranch. This money was located by Bureau agents in the early morning hours of September 27th in a cotton patch on Coleman's ranch. They were both indicted in Dallas, Texas, on October 4, 1933, charged with harboring a fugitive and conspiracy. And on October 17, 1933, Coleman, after entering a plea of guilty, was sentenced to serve 1 year and 1 day, and Casey, after trial and conviction, was sentenced to serve 2 years in the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. Another outlaw, Charles Mackley, did not begin a criminal career in earnest until his early 30s. He was arrested for receiving stolen property in Detroit, Michigan a few times in 1921, but he was found not guilty. Over the next 3 years, Mackley was arrested a number of times for other crimes in Missouri. On July 30th, 1924, he was arrested in Wichita, Kansas for bank robbery under the alias of Charles McGray. He was sentenced to 15 years, but was paroled in May 1928. A few days later, he robbed a bank in Hammond, Indiana. He was apprehended on June 2, 1928, and sentenced to 10 to 20 years. Charles Mackley entered Indiana State Prison in Michigan City on June 25, 1928. At the time of his incarceration, Indiana State Prison was on the silent system. Prisoners remained silent during work hours and in the dining hall. He was not a model prisoner, but incurred only minor infractions during his stay at Indiana State, possessing contraband cigarette papers. It was here that he became friends with a number of prominent bank robbers, including Harry Pierpont, Homer Van Meter, John Hamilton, Russell Clark, and John Dillinger. Dillinger was paroled in May 1933 and had pistols smuggled into Mackley, Pierpont, Hamilton, Clark, and several other convicts. The pistols were smuggled in a crate of thread that was delivered to the prison shirt shop. As a result, a total of 10 armed men escaped from the main gate of Indiana State Prison. On September 26, 1933, the 10 escapees were Pierpont, Russell Clark, Mackley Hamilton, James Jenkins, Ed Schaus, Walter Dietrich, James Clark, Joseph Fox, and Joseph Burns. The escapees immediately split into two groups. Dietrich, Fox, Burns, and James Clark commandeered a car at gunpoint from a sheriff that was taking a prisoner to Michigan City and split from the others. Charles remained with Harry Pierpont's group. They went to the home of Pierpont's girlfriend, Mary Kinder, to change out of their prison uniforms, and then hid out at a farm owned by Pierpont's parents near Leipzig, Ohio. 9 days later, on October 12th, gang members converged on the jail where Dillinger was being held. Pierpont, Mackley, and Russell Clark entered the facility, while Ed Schaus remained outside as a lookout. The three men confronted Sheriff Jesse Sarber in the presence of Deputy Wilbur Sharp and Sarber's wife, and stated that they were from Indiana State Prison with a transfer request for Dillinger. When the sheriff asked to see their credentials, Pierpont shot him in the abdomen. Mackley and one other man then physically assaulted the sheriff, mortally injuring him. They locked the deputy and Sarber's wife in a cell and left Sarber for dead while they freed Dillinger and made their escape. On October 14th, Dillinger, Mackley, and the gang stole guns, ammunition, and bulletproof vests from a police station in Auburn, Indiana. A week later, they pulled a similar heist at a police station in Peru, Indiana. On October 23rd, the gang used its new arsenal to rob a bank in Greencastle, escaping with $74,000. By the end of the year, Charles Mackley ranked 4th on Illinois' list of public enemies, behind John Dillinger, Harry Pierpont, and John Red Hamilton. On January 25, 1934, while the gang was lying low in Tucson, Arizona, a fire broke out in a leaky furnace at the Hotel Congress, where Mackley and Clark were staying. They were rescued by the fire department and bribed a fireman, William Benedict, to retrieve their suitcases, which contained their guns. Days after the fire, Benedict identified Mackley from his mugshot in a True Detective magazine. Mackley was apprehended at the Crabtree Electric Company, shopping for a radio, using the alias J.C. Davies. The rest of the gang was apprehended shortly afterwards. Dillinger was extradited to Crown Point, Indiana to stand trial for the murder of Officer William O'Malley during his and Hamilton's robbery of the First National Bank in East Chicago on January 15th, while Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark were sent back to Indiana State Prison under the supervision of Sheriff Don Sarber, the son of the Allen County sheriff they had killed. All three were later extradited to Lima, Ohio, to stand trial for Sheriff Sarber's murder. Testimony from Ed Schaus saw Mackley, Clark, and Pierpont convicted in 3 consecutive trials over the course of 2 weeks in March 1934, while Dillinger, who had escaped Crown Point and joined up with Babyface Nelson, robbed banks in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Mason City, Iowa. On March 24, 1934, Charles Mackley and Harry Pierpont received death sentences, while Clark received a life sentence. The three were transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus. While waiting for their turn in the electric chair, Mackley and Pierpont carved a pair of revolvers from large bars of soap and blackened them with shoe polish. On September 22, 1934, the two used these props to attempt an escape. They assaulted a guard and freed Clark from his cell nearby. Before they had gone far, Clark, who was not looking at an imminent death sentence, lost his nerve and retreated to his cell. Moments later, armed guards arrived and shot Mackley and Pierpont. Mackley, hit in the thorax and abdomen, died on the scene. Pierpont was seriously wounded, but survived and was later executed. Mackley's death certificate states that internal hemorrhaging from these wounds caused his death. He is buried in the Sugar Ridge Cemetery in Leipzig, Ohio. While a habitual criminal, Mackley cultivated the appearance and demeanor of a prosperous, legitimate businessman. In between crimes, he worked as a salesman and insurance agent and could easily pass for a respectable citizen. A story often told of Charles Mackley is that sometime in the mid-1920s, after robbing a bank, he went straight to a civic luncheon at which he was giving the keynote speech. The story itself is most likely apocryphal, but its popularity gives an insight into the man's charisma. Russell Lee "Booby" Clark was an American thief, bank robber, and prison escapee. He is best known as the good-natured member of the John Dillinger gang and participated in armed holdups with them in a 3-month crime spree across the Midwestern United States from October 1933 until his capture in January 1934. A native of Oaktown, Knox County, Indiana, Russell Clark's criminal career began shortly after his dishonorable discharge from the United States Marines in 1919. He was a partner of Ralston Blackie Linton during the early 1920s and together robbed a series of illicit roadhouses. In 1926, Clark was a suspect in the kidnapping of 2 West Terre Haute bootleggers and the murder of Joe Papalardo in Danville, Illinois. That same year, both Jack Morrison and Clark confessed to robbing the Bellevue Club in Evansville, Indiana, on August 26th, but the owner, Charles Cotton Jones, refused to press charges, and the case was dropped. The following year, Clark went on a crime spree with Frank Badgley and Charles Hovius in northeast Indiana and robbed several banks. Clark was finally caught after his first robbery from either Huntertown or Fort Wayne, Indiana, and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment on December 11th or 12th, 1927. He spent his term at the state penitentiary in Michigan City, and while there, learned from veteran stick-up artists. Clark's bitterness and rebellious attitude led to disciplinary problems with prison authorities. He made 3 unsuccessful escape attempts and was one of the ringleaders of an inmate strike in 1929. Clark was a popular jokester among inmates and was part of a clique which included Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, John "Red" Hamilton, Homer Van Meter, and John Dillinger. When Dillinger was paroled in May 1933, he launched a series of bank raids to finance the escape of his friends and was able to smuggle guns into the prison only 4 months after his release. On September 26, 1933, Clark and 9 other convicts used the guns to help in a mass escape from the penitentiary. Along with Pierpont, Mackley, and Hamilton, the other escapees included James "Oklahoma Jack" Clark, Walter Dietrich, Ed Schaus, Joseph Fox, James Jenkins, and Joseph Burns. Dillinger had been arrested in Dayton, Ohio, 4 days prior to the prison break, and Clark and the others quickly began planning to free him from custody. Stealing $14,000 from a bank in St. Mary's on October 3, 1933, they broke Dillinger out of prison in Lima, Ohio, 9 days later. Sheriff Jess Sarber was killed by Pierpont during the escape. Clark and the rest of the gang began raiding police stations in Auburn and Peru, Indiana, stocking up on weapons, ammunition, and bulletproof vests in preparation for a violent 3-month crime spree across the Midwest. Clark was absent from the gang's first robbery in Greencastle, Indiana on October 23rd, missing out on his share of the $18,428 in cash and $56,300 in negotiable bonds, but was with them the following month when the gang stole $27,000 from a bank in Racine, Wisconsin. The gang were forced to use 4 hostages as human shields in order to make their getaway. On December 13, 1933, Clark also took part in the robbery of a Chicago bank by chiseling through the walls and into the vault, where they emptied 96 safety deposit boxes. The official report lists the theft of only $8,700 in cash. However, authorities estimated the gang may have gotten away with unreported cash and jewelry valued as high as $50,000. Following the Chicago bank heist, the state of Illinois published a list of public enemies. Of the 21 names listed, Clark was ranked 5th behind Dillinger, Pierpont, Hamilton, and Mackley, respectively. The gang decided to hide out in Florida during the Christmas holidays and, by New Year's Day, regrouped in Tucson, Arizona to plan their next move. Clark and his girlfriend, Opal Long, were the first to arrive on January 10th, and the rest following behind over the next week and a half. On January 22, 1934, less than a day after their reunion, a fire broke out in their hotel. A local firefighter, apparently an avid fan of detective pulp magazines, recognized both Clark and Mackley. The authorities were informed, and the hotel was raided 3 days later. Clark was the first to be arrested and was reportedly pistol-whipped into unconsciousness when resisting arrest and going for a weapon. Dillinger, Pierpont, and Mackley were also arrested in the raid. Dillinger was extradited to Indiana to stand trial for the murder of an East Chicago police officer, while Clark and the others were returned to Michigan City. Transferred to Lima, they were tried for the murder of Sheriff Sarber. The trial began on Valentine's Day of 1934, and both Pierpont and Mackley were sentenced to death the following month. Russell Clark expected the same sentence and expressed disinterest in his own trial. He was often seen yawning loudly and sleeping in court. His lawyer, Louis Piquet, a known underworld lawyer in Chicago, was able to persuade the jury to recommend mercy in Clark's case, especially as the triggerman was already sentenced to death. Clark was sentenced to life in prison on March 24th. The three men still held out hope that they would be liberated once more by Dillinger. When Dillinger was gunned down by federal agents in Chicago 4 months later, they decided to break out themselves. On September 22, 1934, a little more than a year after their last escape, Pierpont and Mackley surprised their guards using pistols made from soap cakes, blackened with shoe polish, and escaped from their cells. They then moved on to free Clark and 6 other inmates, but were stopped when they reached a set of newly installed steel doors. The convicts were then met by guards who fired at them, killing Mackley and leaving Pierpont seriously wounded, while Clark and the other prisoners retreated back to their cells. Clark remained imprisoned in Columbus, Ohio, for the next 34 years until being paroled for health reasons on August 14, 1968. He died of cancer in Detroit on Christmas Eve only 4 months after his release. He was the last surviving member of the original Dillinger gang. Pearl Elliott was a notorious madam of Kokomo, Indiana. She was best known as an early associate of the Prohibition-era gangster Harry Pierpont, and later of the bank robber John Dillinger. Along with the gun mole Mary Kinder, she was one of 2 women listed on the Chicago Police Department's Public Enemies list in 1933. Born October 21, 1887, in Hillisburg, Clinton County, Indiana, the daughter of John Newton and Mary Bell Booker McDonald. The family were residing in Ward 3 of the city of Frankfort, Clinton County by 1900. Pearl married Earl C. Crawford in 1907 in Coles County, Illinois. Her second marriage was to Charles E. McGath on December 20, 1911, in Logansport, Indiana. Her third marriage was to William Jasper Hughes on May 25, 1918, in Howard County, Indiana, and later that year the couple were living at 1601 North McCann, with Hughes' occupation listed as laborer. By 1920, they were living at 518 Union Street in Kokomo, where his occupation was listed as a buyer and seller of horses. The following year, they were still at the same address, but he was listed as a horse buyer. Elliott was well known to the local authorities in Kokomo, frequently appearing in the police blotter of the local paper, a record of arrests and other events at the police station. On November 30th, 1929, she was a victim of a crime when the radiator cap was stolen from her car while parked outside her residence, reported as 606 North Market Street. Her home was raided by Kokomo police on the weekend of December 14, 1929, and she was charged with operating a house of ill fame. The case was later dismissed by Judge George Schenck in the city court. In the 1930 city directory of Kokomo, Pearl and her husband were listed as residing at 606 North Market Street. In September of the same year, Pearl, along with Mrs. John Kiefer and Miss Bernice Rose, were guests of Mrs. Sylvia Clevenger of Terre Haute. Sylvia would later be listed in dealings with the Dillinger Gang concerning bank robbers. On September 18, 1931, Pearl Elliott was one of 8 people taken into custody during a police raid of Washington Street, where she was listed as an old offender. She was charged with operating a disorderly house and pleaded guilty when brought before Judge Schenck. On the December 22, 1931, Curly Keene, a local criminal who was arrested at Pearl's residence on North Washington Street, implicated himself in the robbery of a Peru grocery store. In the 1932 City Directory of Kokomo, Elliott and her husband were listed as furnishing rooms in the North Washington area. At the time of a robbery of the South Side State Bank in Kokomo in 1925, Pearl Elliott reportedly harbored the bank robbers Harry Pierpont, Ted Skier, and Earl Northern at her boarding house on the corner of Washington and Madison Streets. Shortly after their escape from the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City on September 26, 1933, there were reports that Pierpont and other members of the gang were in Kokomo at Elliott's home. In a jailhouse interview, Harry Pierpont denied that he had any use for Elliott since his robbery in Kokomo in 1925. He stated that he was in Kokomo the day after the prison break from Michigan City and visited Elliott's house on North Washington Street, but did not find her there. She disappeared from the Kokomo area after the release of John Dillinger from the Lima, Ohio, jail by Harry and his associates on October 12, 1933. Pearl Elliott was alleged to be a treasurer and advance fixer for the Dillinger Gang. In December 1933, Harold Trimby, arrested by police in Milwaukee, reported that John Dillinger had been in that city 2 weeks previously. Dillinger was reportedly in the company of Harry Pierpont, Russell Clark, Dewey Elliott, and Pearl Elliott, and the gang were in Milwaukee trying to dispose of $40,000 in bonds obtained from a robbery at Racine, Wisconsin, on November 20th. A month later, Pearl Elliott was listed on Chicago Police Department's Public Enemies list, with orders to shoot to kill as an associate of Dillinger. Local police in Kokomo noted that she had been known to harbor criminals in the past, and just prior to the escape of the convicts from Michigan City, she had operated a barbecue north of Kokomo on Highway 31. On January 25, 1934, members of the Indiana State Police raided the boarding house formerly operated by Pearl Elliott, based on a tip that members of the gang were expected to be there. The raid took place just hours before Dillinger and the rest of his gang were captured in Tucson, Arizona. On February 16, 1934, Pearl eluded Peru. Indiana police, who had stationed a roadblock on U.S. Route 31 upon reports from Kokomo police that she had been seen heading in that direction. A few weeks later, a tip that a man resembling John Dillinger was seen in Chicago traveling with a woman resembling Pearl Elliott failed to pan out. On April 5, 1934, Pearl Elliott was reportedly seen in Kokomo at a service station where she was in the company of 2 men and was driving a Pontiac sedan. Kokomo police reported that she was not wanted by local police or not even Chicago or Wisconsin officials at the time. Pearl was reportedly seen in Mooresville, Indiana 2 months later at the funeral of Dillinger. A correspondent from the International News Service stated that she was with 4 other women of the Dillinger Gang. The women were believed to be Irene Williams, Margaret Behrens, Babe Longick, and Mary Kinder. Elliott was quoted as saying, "I came here for a last look at Johnny. He never threw me down, and I wouldn't do it on him." In November of 1934, news reports from Frankfort, Indiana, said that Pearl was dying at her mother's home from an incurable disease. Her husband Dewey was reportedly living in Florida at the time. Pearl Elliott died August 10, 1935, at her mother's home in Clinton County, Indiana. She was buried in Green Lawn Cemetery in Clinton County.